commence the second part of today's discussion with a presentation by Dr. Rosanna Scutella. Rosanna currently holds the position of Senior Research Fellow at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research at the University of Melbourne. She's also the Deputy Project Director of Journeys Home, a longitudinal study of factors affecting housing stability. In 2010, Rosanna was on secondment to the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet as a Principal Policy Officer. I've heard Rosanna present several years ago about the early findings from Journeys Home, and I found it fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing an update on that material. It's a very interesting project, hopefully producing some wonderful outcomes, but they'll be confirmed for us in the very near future. Over to you, Rosanna.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Rather than give you a general overview of the Journeys Home study, I am going to be talking today about one of the projects that we've started using the Journeys Home data that is still in its very, very early stages, so still very preliminary analysis, that has been funded by Uhuru. So we'd like to thank Uhuru for getting us started on this project. And I'd also like to thank, of course, the Department of Social Security for funding the Journeys Home study to begin with, and not only for initially funding it, but for continuing to support it throughout the life of the study, both financially and by being involved in the project as we've gone along. So I'm going to talk today about what we're finding in Journeys Home in relation to the relationship between housing markets and individual risks of homelessness. In the study, we're also looking at whether there's a relationship between local labour markets and homelessness. It's not in the title here because, spoiler alert, it doesn't look like there's much of a clear relationship between the local labour market and individual risks of homelessness, or at least the relationship is much more complicated than we had initially thought. So we need to do much further analysis of that. And it's a project that I'm working on with other people at both RMIT and at the Melbourne Institute, the University of Melbourne, which is where I'm from. So Gavin Wood at RMIT and Uhuru is involved in this project, and Guy Johnson, who is off in New York now, and Yuping Sen, who is my colleague at the Melbourne Institute. So the motivation for this project was that there aren't that many studies that look at the relationship between housing markets and homelessness anywhere in the world, really, and even fewer in Australia. There are actually only two studies that we know about that explicitly look at the relationship between housing markets and homelessness in Australia. The first of those studies was done by Deb Battenham, and that was a Victorian-based study, and that was using census data. And the second study is still work in progress that Gavin Wood is involved with, and Shelley, I believe, is also involved with that study. And they're kind of currently looking at the relationship between housing markets and other area level factors and homelessness across Australia using census data again. And while these studies are fantastic and they can identify lots of interesting kind of relationships, the census data does have its limitations. One of the limitations is that when you're looking at the relationship between housing markets and homelessness, you want to kind of compare the relationship with housing markets with individual risk factors, and the census data doesn't include many individual risk factors that you can look at. Also, because the census data researchers usually only have access to the area level information, not the unit record information, you can't examine how the individual risk factors interact with the broad area level factors and housing markets in particular. But the biggest limitation of the census data is that it only gives you a static picture of what's going on. People might respond to housing and labour markets in various ways, and one of the ways they might respond to them is by moving, so they can move across areas. And also housing and labour markets might affect entries to homelessness different to the way they affect exits from homelessness, and the census data can't give you that kind of information. So Journeys Home, which is a longitudinal study of people vulnerable to homelessness, is the perfect kind of data set to look at this more dynamic picture of mobility and the relationship between housing markets and homelessness. And importantly, Journeys Home is a study that not only includes people who are homeless, but also people who are at risk or vulnerable to homelessness. So they weren't necessarily homeless when we first interviewed them, but they were a very vulnerable group. So we can observe them as they enter and exit homelessness over time, and that's really important for this kind of analysis. And I'm sort of assuming that most of you are familiar with Journeys Home, but I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Can I see a show of hands for who kind of knows about the Journeys Home study? Okay, so it's not as many as I thought. So I might, talk about it in a little bit more detail then. So the main research questions that we're asking in this study is whether individuals are more likely to experience homelessness in areas with certain housing or labour market characteristics. But because we kind of think that the relationship might be different for entries and exits from homelessness, we're also going to look at whether individuals are more likely to enter homelessness in areas with certain housing or labour market characteristics, or whether individuals are more likely to exit homelessness in areas with certain housing or labour market characteristics as well. So now I will talk a little bit more about the Journeys Home study itself, the survey. It's a national longitudinal survey of people vulnerable to homelessness or at risk of homelessness. The data that I'm going to be using in this analysis is from the first 5 waves of the study. So we interview people at 6 monthly intervals. So the 5 waves of the study covers roughly a 2 to 2.5 year period. We've just wrapped up fieldwork for wave 6 of the study, which at this stage is going to be the final wave of the study. But I didn't have that data ready to include it in this analysis. The population that we draw our sample from, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next slide, are Centrelink clients that were either flagged as being homeless, at risk of homelessness, or that weren't flagged, but that we identified as being vulnerable to homelessness. And the sample was stratified by region, so that smaller areas kind of oversampling in. And also clustered, because we do face-to-face interviews, so we can't actually, it's not really cost effective to go to some more remote areas and send interviewers out there. So we clustered the sample across 36 locations, across the whole country though, so we have clusters that are in each of the states and territories. Just under 3,000 cases were issued to field. And in the first wave of the study, about 1,700 people responded. So that turns out to be about a response rate of 62-ish%, which is quite a good response rate, even if you compare to kind of mainstream population studies. So now a little bit more about the population that we drew the sample from. So one of the trickiest things with doing a survey like this, like a large-scale survey that you want to be representative of some kind of population, is that it's kind of hard to identify who's going to be at risk of homelessness. You can't just do a general sample of the entire population, because only a small proportion of the entire population are going to be experiencing homelessness at all, so your sample size would just be tiny. Even if you start with the Centrelink income support population, only a small group, like the overall population of Centrelink income support recipients is about 5 million. So even if you randomly sampled across them, not many would be experiencing homelessness over a short time frame. But luckily, from 2009 or 2010, Centrelink started flagging people through their Centrelink homelessness indicator. They started flagging people as homeless or at risk of homelessness, depending on their circumstances. Now, obviously, this wasn't going to be a perfect kind of indication of who was homeless or who was at risk of homelessness, and it does require that people are kind of forthcoming with their information. But it's better than anything else that we had. But in recognising that Centrelink weren't going to be flagging everyone who was homeless, we also identified a third group, which is the target population. A third group who were vulnerable to homelessness, who had characteristics that were very similar to the other two groups, but that hadn't been flagged as being homeless. So the total population that we selected came to about 138,000 people, and that includes people from each of those groups. And then we drew a kind of random sample across that population in 36 areas to roughly represent each of those groups there. So the profile of the Wave 1 respondents, I'm not going to go into this in very detail because there's lots of numbers in these tables, and you don't really need to look at them in much detail, but I just wanted to highlight that the respondents were overall a very disadvantaged group. They were much younger than the Australian population. They are much more likely to be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. They're more likely to be single and less likely to have children than the general Australian population. They have much lower levels of educational qualifications. Only around 20% were employed, and around half weren't even in the labour force. So they have very little connection to the labour market overall. And they are much more likely to have diagnosed mental health conditions than the Australian population, and to smoke or drink alcohol at risky levels or use illicit substances than the Australian population. So they're a very, very disadvantaged kind of group. So the strength of a longitudinal study, of course, is in how able you are to kind of keep as many people from the initial survey. And we've been pretty successful at that. So on the screen here show what the response outcomes have been from waves 2 onwards, waves 2 to wave 5. And if you focus just on the top line, the top row of completed interviews, it shows that attrition has actually been very low. We've managed to keep over 84% of our initial wave 1 respondents at wave 5, which is quite good, and relative to other surveys as well, it's quite a low attrition rate. But obviously attrition isn't going to be random, so there are going to be certain types of people that are more likely to drop out of the survey than others. But luckily for us, we have access to people's Centrelink records, so we at least have some information on them, and we can use that information to construct weights so that we get a more representative population at the end. So in the study that I'm talking about today, the way we define homelessness is using the cultural definition of homelessness, which I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with. So the idea behind the cultural definition is that there's a minimum community standard that people expect in contemporary Australian society, and it includes those that are sleeping rough or squatting, staying temporarily with others, in emergency or crisis accommodation, or in boarding houses. So this is not the definition that the ABS currently use to enumerate the homelessness, although it was the definition that they used to use. And the main difference between the cultural definition and the ABS definition is that the cultural definition doesn't include overcrowding. And we also operationalise the definition slightly differently as well, but because we have more information than what's in the census. Okay, thanks. So in this slide, I just want to show what the prevalence of homelessness is across the 5 waves of the study. So if you focus on the bottom row, which is the total row, it shows that in the first wave, around 27% of our respondents were homeless or culturally homeless. And over the course of the 5 waves, the prevalence drops a little bit, but it remains at kind of around 20% by wave 5. Males are more likely to be homeless than females in our study. The older respondents are more likely to be homeless than the younger respondents. But you have to be careful there and not interpret that as meaning older people are more likely to be homeless, because you have to remember that our overall population is quite young. It's just that of those who are vulnerable, older people are less likely to be in our population. They're less likely to be at risk, but if they're in our population, they're much more likely to be homeless. And then Indigenous Australians have a higher homelessness prevalence as well in the study. So what we were interested in, of course, is looking at the relationship between homelessness and housing market and labour market characteristics. So we bring in external data and match it in with our unit record data on area level characteristics of where people are resident in. So we bring in census information on the median rents in statistical area 4, area level classification. And we bring in the unemployment rate, or the local unemployment rate, from the ABS labour force statistics. And here you'll see that we find that homeless rates are higher in areas with higher housing costs, higher median rents, and in areas with low unemployment rates. And that's because areas with high housing costs tend to be areas with low unemployment. So then we wanted to explore a little bit about about the geographic mobility of people and whether there's any relationship with homelessness there. So in this slide, we compare those that don't move across SA4 areas between 2 waves with those that do move across SA4 areas, and then look at the homeless rates of the 2 groups, and then also both the entry and exit rates, entry rates to homelessness and exit rates from homelessness. So in the slide, you'll see that those that move across SA4s have higher homelessness rates, or are more at risk of homelessness, and they're much more likely to enter homelessness, or about 3 times as likely to enter homelessness as those who stay within the same SA4. And they're also more likely to exit, but by not as much. The relative difference isn't as high. So we wanted to delve a little bit more into the characteristics of the areas that people were in as well. So first we focus on those that stay in the same SA4 area across 2 waves. And in this slide we show the homelessness rates and the entry and exit rates by the housing and labour market characteristics of the areas that people are in. And you'll see that homelessness is, homeless rates are higher in high rent areas and lower in low unemployment areas. So that's kind of similar to what we were finding for the overall, for all respondents. If you look at the entry rates, they don't seem to vary too much by the housing and labour market characteristics, but the exit rates do. The exit rates are much lower for people that are in high rent areas and much lower for people who are in low unemployment areas. Then we look at the movers, and for the movers we can compare the area that they were in before they moved with the area that they're currently in and compare the housing market characteristics of those two areas and the labour market characteristics of those two areas. So here we present the homeless rates and the entry and exit rates based on the comparisons of those characteristics. And interestingly, what you see in this slide is that homeless rates don't seem to vary hugely according to the housing market and labour market characteristics of people. The entry rates don't seem to vary, well, not consistently at least, and not in huge, the magnitudes of the differences aren't huge. But again, the exit rates do show a clear pattern. So the exit rates are much higher for people that moved from a higher housing cost area to a lower cost housing area. And interestingly, they don't seem to differ very much depending on the characteristics of the labour market that they moved from or moved to. So yeah, it doesn't look like people that are moving to areas with more labour market opportunities are any more likely to exit homelessness than those that are moving to areas with fewer labour market opportunities. So we think that it's because it's the housing related factors that are driving people's movements. So people are moving to areas with low cost housing because they need to live somewhere. Yeah, there might be a more complicated relationship with the labour market. Okay. So tentative conclusions, because this is still very early days in this study. We seem to be finding that housing markets matter quite a bit for those at risk of homelessness. We don't find a clear relationship with local labour markets, but of course we're not kind of capturing the differences in the characteristics of people. The labour market might be more important for younger people, and we haven't kind of controlled for age in any way. It might be more important for young people to be in areas with better labour market opportunities, or it might just take a bit longer for people for their risks of homelessness to decrease after they have connection with the labour market. So we need to look at longer time periods. And this is all part of further research, and importantly what we're going to be explicitly looking at in the study is the interaction of individual risk factors and these area level kind of structural factors, and how they contribute to homelessness, as it might be that people with certain risk factors might be more prone to homelessness if they're facing tighter housing markets than others. For example, ex-offenders, for example, might be more likely to face more discrimination in areas where there's very little housing supply for them to access. So yeah, they're the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. Thank you.